So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Mark Ditko from Zen Engineering. He is the Zen dude. If you don't know Mark, pretty good guy. I kind of learned modeling from his books. His books are very well written, and you just go page to page and you're pretty well set to go. So with that, Mark, let me hand it over to you and take it.
Okay, let me just do this little intro slide here. Yeah, we have sort of the Essential Series book that covers the basics of open roads itself. And then we do have a kind of a specialty series that we keep kind of adding to. I'm primarily the one doing most of the writing. Carl Dauber, who was did the last presentation, does the drainage stuff. But this is kind of where we're at now in terms of formal, and all of these books have a companion training class that goes with them. And then, so these are the books that we actually use in our training classes. So you would get, if you did a training class, all this, and the books are, I mean, you probably they're all 2 volumes, and you end up getting probably about 1,000 pages of training and reference material, with each topic. So just a little bio on me. I graduated at Pittsburgh, at Pitt. Born and raised in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Ended up starting with ink on Mylar in the 80s. So did quite a bit of survey. In fact, I intended to stay in the survey sector because I liked it so much. But then ended up accidentally falling into a civil engineering spot in the office, and ran into the early versions of inroads there. Started on the first version and pretty much have been using it ever since. I did work at Intergraph for a while in 95 through the kind of the Bentley purchase. And then in 2001, I left Bentley and started Zen Engineering, and the rest is history, as they say. So with that, let's get into this. Okay, so this is really going to be, I'll say, a real whirlwind, because I'm going to try to really compress all the basic core of my 4-day survey class into pretty much 45 minutes. Some of this stuff, and I assume that some of you already know about open roads, or maybe used some of the earlier Bentley survey products. So I'm assuming that you have some foundation moving into this. And so kind of with that, I'm really going to just skim through and really just fly through certain topics. Just to make a note, basically, just for the record, this video's obviously it's being recorded, so you kind of circle back and slow the pace down a little bit or rewatch something. But I'm just gonna keep a pretty quick pace through certain things, but then dial it down onto things that I think really need some emphasis. And hopefully I kind of get through this onslaught of material here, and hopefully have some time for questions and answers, where I can kind of circle back on something or touch on something that maybe needs to be expanded. So with that, first up, I'll tell you what, this has been a struggle, and survey, and I'll say it's like drainage. Drainage has its kind of continual challenges, I'll say. Survey has the same thing. I felt like 2020 R1 was probably the most stable, predictable package. That's where I was really stabilizing my material on. I really thought they had it nailed. And then 2020 was I skipped R2. R3 came out, and there were some things that got broken. 2021 came out, which is what I'm going to be running here. And they broke the textual and graphical manipulators. They changed the way some of the settings, especially the mesh match field code, changed. All this stuff, I've logged all this stuff. And I took a glance at 2022 R1, and oh my God, I'm not happy right now. I got to get in there. I'm hoping for 2022 R2, and hopefully that does take care of some issues. But I got to get in there and do some more logs. I don't know why some of this stuff slips by, and the logs that I'm logging aren't really getting kind of picked up. So I got to have a conversation with Bentley. So anyway, with that. Why In-Road Survey? Just like or Open Road Survey, it's just like In-Road Survey. To take that field data in whatever format it's in, post-process it, break it down into digestible math, produce the CAD drawing, build the surface model, push it downstream. So that purpose, has always existed, still the same. Nothing's really changed there. Kicking this off, you're starting a new job, obviously. From seed, everything in open roads, new geometry, new corridors, everything's, you've got to start from seed. So in this case, survey starts with a 3D seed, set the workspace. This is just open roads, 101. Now, once you're in there, you have to create a field book. I'm going to do get through these slides, and I'll kind of jump out to the software periodically. So creating a field book, there's 3 different ways. One of them is to literally just drag and drop the files into the Explorer window and automatically creates the field book. Another way is to go into the Explorer under Survey, expand that, and right-click, pull out the new, and create a new field book that way. And then the last way, which is kind of unusual, I generally don't do the formal methods on the ribbon. If there's a shortcut, I'm usually doing a shortcut. But in this case, I do tend to do this one. I just go to the survey workflow, and under the field book, there's a new field book. And this is pretty much my go-to way to create a field book, because it allows you to name it right there. The other 2 methods just give it a default name, which then you always have to rename it. So this is really my go-to method now. Now, when you after you create a field book, obviously you got to get some data in there, like In-Road Survey. And In-Road Survey obviously was my root. So if you're a Geopack person or MX Road, apologies. I was a ex-In-Roads guy, so that's always going to be my speak. But if you could read it in a notepad file, Open Road Survey could import it. It may be set up already with certain file types, or if it's just a fixed point file with some other formats, you could bring that in through the import wizard, just like you always could in the past. There are the formal ways on the ribbon. You could, there's options here on the ribbon to open up data. You could right click on it, import the different file types. And the one that I tend to use is basically dragging and dropping into the field book. Now, there is an issue with this. I haven't checked the recent version to see if it's been fixed, that if you're grabbing multiple files, it doesn't bring them in order. So in the case of the survey that I use as a sample in my training class, it has a traverse and then 24 days of collection. If you grab all of those, they tend to come in a sort of randomized order. It doesn't work in this particular job because they introduce additional control in later days. And then obviously if they bring in more control and then the next day they occupy it, you can't bring in that next day before they actually introduce the control. So it's unhappy. So I basically when I'm using this drag and drop, and I'm bringing in one file at a time. Yeah, it's a little bit clunkier, but I got an enhancement. Hopefully at some point they're going to fix that. Okay, now when you create a field book, and you may or may not see this depending on how your survey settings are set up, or I should say how many survey settings that you have in your configuration. But every time you create a field book, what happens is it automatically brings in a collection of survey settings that get married to that field book. In these survey settings, and just kind of at a high level, then I'll take a deeper dive into some of these. Basically, it defines the formatting. You know, do you have the control code first and then the feature code after that? Are you using comma separators? Are you using space separators? So the format, if you are collecting any attributes, those are addressed in the survey settings. If you have control points, and I'm going to touch on some of these, so I'll bring some kind of clarity to these. This is where the control codes, link codes are stored, adjustments of the display symbology, and the terrain settings. So let's kind of look at some of these things. So the first one, I kind of want to we'll dial it down a notch here, is the attribute overrides. So attributes used to be part in the In-ROAD survey world. They were actually part of the code, the configuration of the code itself. There was a section in there where you could create attributes on a specific style that was mapped to an alpha code or a numeric code for the field. That's not the case here. Here, attributes are set up in the actual survey settings. They're not part of the feature definition, the object identifier, so to speak. So if you're in the field and you're collecting attributes, like you collect trees, and you collect also the size of the tree, maybe the diameter, the type of tree, you know, the spread of the tree or something, or manholes and the type of the manholes, that's all information that's attribute information. So the way that it works in In-ROAD. So I'm in the Explorer here. I'm just in a survey file that I use as a sample. And if we go to the standards, and when you create a field book, it automatically copies in some standards, the survey settings under the standards area. So I'm just going to go to the properties here. So these are all the categories of information that's in the survey settings. So if we just kind of look at the attributes, there's a section in here, and there's a lot of stuff in the survey settings. And this is the way this is designed now, is all this stuff really needs to be pre-configured. This is not something the user is going to do on the fly. You know, somebody's going to need to know, if you're using attributes, exactly what are those attributes, exactly how they need to be interpreted so that they could be pre-programmed into the software. So the attribute overrides, these are built in this interface here. It is kind of a long interface, but it's basically looking at, it's basically deciphering when a code is brought in that has attributes. You know, what is it? What's the feature definition? What does it contain? You know, what's the attribute? And then basically, what does it do? When if it encounters something with a particular, say, drip attribute or a size attribute, this dialog is basically telling it, what do I do with that now? In this case, what I did was I had it resize these trees based on the drip line, so that it would scale to the size of the drip. So all these attributes, this is all something that has to be done from a configuration perspective. The user will probably not ever go in here. This is something that only is done from a configuration perspective. And then as long as the attributes are collected in line with this out in the field, everything is just kind of a beautiful thing from there, I'll say. Okay. The next thing here that I hadn't actually gotten into on the In-ROAD survey side, don't really know if there was something that was exactly like this, is the idea of control points. So control points in the sample survey that I have my training on, they ran an initial control down this roadway. And it was really just these green little flags here, and then the purple numbered. They ran that initial traverse, you know, they balanced it, adjusted it, tied into control both sides. And then throughout the job, they ran little spur lines and then occupied that information. So there was a little side road here up top, and they ran down, these 15, 17, 78, and then ran a 17 out there and a 19. So, and then expanded it as they felt like they needed more control. Now, the problem the problem that the control points solves is when they ran this traverse and they got it all adjusted and they have all those points stored, now they actually know what they are. When they went and occupied, as they collected subsequent days, they went and occupied that point, it also got stored. But that point that's stored is not the coordinate of the adjusted. So what happened is when I brought that information in, it had to be resolved. So what OpenRoads allows you to do is take points, and you could do it very easily by in a batch type mode or one at a time, and basically take that point and store it as a control point. Now, what you can also do sort of as a preemptory strike is there is an area in here under the points category. Again, this is stored in the survey settings for control points. So if you know what codes are control points, and that when it encounters that, it knows that it needs to store that and use that coordinate, then you could add those in ahead of time and say, look, these are all my control points. So they become kind of senior coordinates. The way that I tend to do it is just sort of add them in as I'm importing the data, which is really easy to do. So, and then those control points are all sort of cataloged in the fieldbook area, so they could always be looked at, reported on, things like that. Link codes, control codes. This is where, I mean, it's a little bit different than In-Road Survey in a sense. There's some rules now that didn't exist before, and there's some, I'll say, some differentiation that really didn't exist before. So, just to kind of do a little backstory, obviously coding is the key. And, field coding, the better it is in the field, the better it's going to import. The object coding, which is the feature itself, is controlled by the feature definition. The feature definition says that's a manhole, put a manhole cell, and it belongs in the terrain or it doesn't. This is the alpha code, this is the numeric code. So the feature definition equates back to In-Road Survey. The style is for the display, whether it goes into the terrain, and for any annotation that goes on it. So the feature definition is the object that still, it applies relative to like the way the style does. And if anybody is familiar with OpenRoads, feature definitions are now the object identifiers. So every field code obviously has to have a feature definition. Those feature definitions, and we're not going to get into that, same kind of thread. The feature definition connects to the feature symbology, connects to the element template to give it the information. Now, I have this little diagram down here, and in my books, and really when OpenRoads first came out, one of the first things I did was I drew what I called my configuration roadmaps. So I did these roadmaps so I can kind of get my head wrapped around, well, what's really connected to what? So, and this is pretty true. This is true for all basic feature definitions. The feature definition, which is really what is assigned by the user, or in survey, assigned by the field code in collection, is connected to a feature symbology. The feature symbology is really like a junction box. So what that does is it allows sort of two paths to be defined. One of them is it points to the element template that says, how do I draw it? The other one, part of this junction box, is it points to an annotation group that says, what kind of textual information do I need to put on it? So all codes have this sort of tree, this mapping behind it. The alpha code, and if you look up in the upper right here, it has a section here under the survey feature category for the alpha code or numeric code if you're using it. But that's all that's necessary to identify it in the field. And then when it gets pulled into the software, it just sort of follows the activities of this tree. It finds the code, it looks at the feature symbology, follows this little breadcrumb trail, goes to the element template, figures out how to draw it, looks over in the annotation group and sees if there's any textual information that needs to get put on it. Now, aside from that, if there's attributes, then it's looking at the survey settings and processing those attributes. So really now what's happening with the collection, and go back to En-ROADS survey, there were generally two codes. You had an object code or the style, and you had a control code. Now they've actually broken it up into three. This three actually always existed, but they never had the definition, I'll say the terminology nomenclature as they do now in OpenRoads. So obviously you have a feature code. So when you're collecting information, you get to give it a feature code. That's the object identifier. And then you have two other specialty coding that you could add in there. One is called a link code. A link code, which again, in En-ROADS, we always just called control codes, but they did make a differentiation now. So link codes is starting a line, ending a line. It's a PC, or it's a PT, and basically adding to the geometrics of it or defining more of the geometrics of it. And then there's control codes. And control codes is something like the JPT, join to a point, or to close. So whether it belongs in the terrain or you want to pull it from the terrain. So now when you're coding in the field, and there's going to have to be some minor adjustments if you're using OpenRoads in the field to the coding, just because there's some subtle changes in terms of the way it interprets this. So you give it a feature code, you give it a link code, and you have this ability to do control codes. Now, in the software, this is also part of the survey settings. So if we kind of jump out here and look into the link code section, this is where these are all defined. Now, the header on this says link codes. These are not just the link codes. These are the link codes. So they have a numeric equivalent, they have an alpha equivalent, user defined, just like the past software. These down here are actually control codes. And the reason that you have to make that differentiation is because when you're in the field and you're doing collection, that object, you're shooting a shot, a single shot, can only have a single link code, cannot have two or more link codes. It can only have a single link code, but it can have any number of control codes. So in En-ROADS, they didn't differentiate between those. You could just string them out as many as you wanted on a single shot. But in OpenRoads survey, that's not true. Don't know why. Obviously, it was part of the programming, nuts and bolts of the software. But you could only have one link code. So what they had to do is they had to invent some. Like if you were starting on a PC, you can't say start space PC like you did in En-ROADS. So they had to create a code for starting on a PC. If you had a non-tangent curve in En-ROADS, you would give it the code. It's a brake line, it's a sidewalk, and you would say space PC space NT, non-tangent curve. Well, you can't use two link codes, so they had to invent a new one for non-tangent PCs. It's a single code. So that's one, I'll say, significant change, and it'll affect you bringing in legacy data. So if you have legacy data where it was coded from an En-ROADS perspective, that's something that has to be addressed if you bring that same file into OpenRoads. Okay. So this where it says link codes is actually link codes, and control codes. So just a couple things. You cannot use dual link codes. So in En-ROADS, where you might have coded a flow line start PC, that's not going to work. And what's going to happen, what you're going to get if you bring that in, it's going to bring in a point number. Say this is point number 210. It's going to bring in and it's going to interpret the flow line as a start, and then believe that you have another flow line that's a PC. And it's going to create another point on the exact same coordinate with an underbar 1. And it's going to say there's a flow line that's now a PC. So what you have to get in here and do is you got to really mop this up. You got to do some cleanup. Anytime you see an underbar 1, that's a flag. That's something that needs to be looked at and determined whether or not it's a problem. It's not always a problem, but in some cases it is. In this case, it is a problem and needs to be edited. Dual feature coding, that's really not a problem. So you can do that. You could say, okay, I'm shooting a curb. It's also an edge of pavement. And it's a start. The only thing they have to be aware of is this also creates a duplicate point. You know, in inroads, you used to be able to have basically what was a shared point. It was a single shot that was the fence and the sidewalk. Open roads can't digest that. So what it has to do is it has to create a point number with a coordinate for one of the feature codes, and then create another one under bar 1 for the next feature code. So there's always going to be 2 points there. Each string has to have its own independent point. And that's so that it does that. Another sort of extreme application of that, maybe not so extreme, but another application is, let's say that you were doing, some riprap or a rock wall, and you were starting, and then a tree line and a start. Again, it doesn't have any problem with that, but what it does is it does create a point 610 that starts there, and another 610 under bar 1 that starts the tree line. So it's just going to generate 2 points at that location. So just be aware of that, because the line or the chain is mapped to the point. So that unique chain, the tree line or the rock wall or whatever, has to have its own unique shot. And the way it does that is it basically duplicates that, replicates it. Okay, best match field code. This is one that has always been kind of problematic, and this is the one I kind of go back to the initial slide, is that it changed. It was running fine in 2020 R1. It broke, or they changed some of the behavior in 2020 R3. They changed the behavior again in 2021 R1, and it was sort of part of it was broken. And then now it's basically dramatically changed in 2022 R1. I'm gotta say, I'm probably going to skip 2022 R1 and go to 2022 R2. So we'll see what's happening there. But it was always just a true or false. So it was just a setting was either basically on or off, or activated or deactivated. The 2022 versions introduced some new options there, which ultimately I'll define. I have a section in my survey book that covers all of the survey settings in a lot of detail. So this is something I'm going to have to kind of investigate, see how it's working, and then we'll document that. The data import items, this is really the area that defines if you're dragging and dropping a file, how does it know what to do with it? So the data input, let's see where here. This is really just the catalog of all the pre-programmed file types from Bentley. So if you drag and drop, a job file, it knows what to do with it. If you drag and drop, a project file or a control file or an XYZ file, it just knows how to interpret it. Some of them are activated and some of them are not. This is actually where you would activate and deactivate them. If it's set to false, it's not active, doesn't understand it. So this is where you can tweak these and deactivate some of these. This is also where if you added your own, text import wizards, you could have those also, added into this list. They did deliver quite a bit of, ones that you would normally do, point number, northing, easting, elevation code. So they did add a lot of text import wizards where typically you had to kind of build those and add those in yourself. So they did add quite a bit of those, but there's also some very specific ones that you probably would not use unless you were doing work with Virginia, or, some of these others. There's some DOT settings here, Missouri, Mississippi. Okay, substitution strings. This is kind of an interesting capability. And what it does is it allows you to just jump out to here. On import, it allows you to look at a specific code and say, if you see an EC, change it to this. So if you see, code RAN, change it. That's actually a monument. If you see a CGS, that's actually a monument. So what it allows you to do is basically do a search and replace on import. It only works on import. It's not retroactive. So if you had a survey and you went, oh, wow, those, TOCs were really TCs, you'd have to do a search and replace here in Open Road Survey. But if you knew it sort of ahead of time, you could create those substitution strings and they're stored in the survey settings so that on import, it's actually doing a search and replace. I think there's a lot of capability in their functionality for, taking in alternate methods of coding and having it literally convert on the fly. Okay, and the terrain model. The terrain model, obviously, it comes right out of the field book. They've made this so much, simpler than, in the past where you had to export it out. Of course, it all depends on the feature definitions, saying, does it belong in the terrain? So all the coding knows whether it contributes to the terrain or not. And the only thing I would make a point here, and if you understand about terrains, then you don't really need to cover anything here. And the only point that I would make, on this is under the terrain, there's the option to create it automatically on import. And that would be set to true. I don't find that I don't need that. I don't need to see the terrain right when I import it because I know I'm going to do corrections and, modifications. I'm going to do checks. I'm going to make sure everything looks right. So I tend to create this basically on the fly. So I will tend to have the create terrain model as set to false because creating a terrain model is almost ridiculously simple. You just go to this is my field book here, my data files. Basically, just go to the field book and create terrain model, and it's created. And it's really just reading all the coding, understanding what contributes to that, and the settings and the display settings based on what is in here under what you have defined here, and it basically just creates that. So the terrain models are very easy to create. So I tend not to create these terrain models until I'm actually ready to start to work with the terrain. Okay, so obviously now there's no separate field book. Everything's in the graphics. What you see in the graphics is the physical data. Just like open roads, anywhere in open roads, you hover over it, it has all this attribute information. Of course, it's giving you, from a survey perspective, all the information that went into that. It has flyout menus, just like everywhere in open roads now. Nothing new there. You've kind of got that all built into the software. It has graphical and textual manipulators. So if this is observational data, you select it. It has all the graphical and textual manipulators, same kind of functionality that you could do anywhere else in open roads. When you're working with survey, they always had the ability to view, the points or the elevations or the code. When you're trying to debug a problem or you look at an issue and you're trying to run it down, you tend to turn the point numbers on to look at the way it was sequentially collected. You want to move a shot. You want to turn the elevations on to make sure it moves and the elevation stays. You want to, just verify, why something is misconnecting. You want to turn the codes on. So all this capability still exists. They're now called decorators or decorations, but they're just mimicking the view survey data, from the In-Road survey, if you're familiar with that. So now we're talking about decorations. Decorations is what just turns those things on off. They're just toggles, temporary displays. In fact, they're not even plottable. I saw a post on the forums the other day is, can I plot these? No. You have to set up your own annotation to be able to get this information on there. Now, it's all tagged on there. The information is all tagged data. You could hover over it and get all that attribute information, but you can't display it physically or plot it. So this is all just temporary, similar to the way it was in In-Road Survey, but in In-Road Survey, when you committed it to graphics, you have the ability to write this to graphics. That doesn't exist anymore. You have to actually set up annotation for each of the specific codes. Now, just as a little tip, these decorations, I go to these all the time. They don't have a separate toolbar that allow you to kind of turn on and off the names, turn on and off the point numbers, which when I'm working in a survey, I'm constantly doing that. So what I end up doing usually is, you know, they're on the analyze. So I might be on the field book tab. I might be on some other tab. So I find myself initially always going to analyze, always going and turn the names on. But you could do this anywhere really in Open Roads. Is if you just right click on here, there's the ability to pin it. And this workflow, the survey workflow, was where I would normally be needing this. You could pin it to the current workflow. So then what happens is it kind of rebuilds the interface a bit, and it adds it into the beginning here, pinning it onto basically every tab now. So I generally work this way where I will pin the decorations onto this so that I could stay on the field book tab, you know, creating new field books, deleting, working here, explorers, details windows here that I'm going to call up. And I have my decorations really always available here. So this ability, just right click on a group, and you could do this anywhere in Open Roads, and just unpin it. You could pin it to all workflows, pin it or unpin it. I do tend to work in a sort of a pin mode just to save myself those couple extra clicks. Okay. Interface wise, you know, anybody that's using Open Roads, they're going to the Explorer. Everything's in the Explorer now. And when you select something from in the Explorer, it's reflecting over the details of it in the properties. So the Explorer and the properties are two panes that you always have sort of docked. Some, you know, and you open them and pin them when you want to. I usually have the Explorer open, and I open up and pin the properties when I need to. And then in inroads survey, there was the field book, and there isn't anything like necessarily like the field book. So now what they have is the survey details. So the survey details is about as close as it comes to the field book. And that's under the field book tab here, details. And basically what this is, it's an interface that populates, can be populated by whatever you basically select or whatever information you want to go in there. So if I go to the survey here and I look at some of the data files, so let me back up. Let's say I want to look at all points. If I select all points in this field book, I'm seeing now all the points in here. And this is all sortable. So you could sort on any of these headers. If you want to look at the linear features, you select all linear features, you're seeing them all for the entire survey. If for some reason you just wanted to go and see the traverse, just the traverse points that were just shot in the traverse, you just select that and it's reflecting it in here. So this allows you to kind of, you know, the details allows you to narrow down what you want to see. You want to see just the linear features of day 2. That's what's in here. And then interactively, when you go here in the software itself, if you hover over something, traditionally you get the fly out. Over here at the end, almost always there's edit point features. What that's doing is that is shoving it into the details window. So this allows you to graphically select something and push it into this window, or through the Explorer window, depending on what you want to get in there. And these are all editing fields. You know, all this stuff is able to be edited. So this is really your one of your editing interfaces. But survey details is something that I generally have closed. And I open it as on demand when I need it and populate it with whatever information I need in there. Okay. When you're getting to the corrections phase and you're looking at looking for issues, a couple of things that, again, I'm not maybe not telling you anything that you don't already know, is definitely you don't want to have your menus in place so everything is kind of established there, you know. And then custom line styles, you want to turn those off. because that potentially could really muddy your display. You want to look at the purity of the line work that was collected. So custom line styles, you want to have those off. And just as an example, there's a gas station here with some medians. Now, I don't know what the heck happened with the collection on this, but this really looks like it's a mess. But if I go to turn off the custom line styles, you'll see that this is the single line that was shot. So when you have custom line styles, you have tree lines, like where exactly is the line? You have, retaining walls and things. When you have custom line styles on, it might not be exactly clear where the shots were taken. So if you turn those off, and I generally, always, preach that, turn it off, you could see exactly where the shots were taken. It makes editing a bit easier. So I will turn the custom line styles off. I turn the observational lines off if you're using observational data. And I got to say, some of this stuff, and I've been working primarily with observational data. If you're working with fixed point files, of course, you don't have observational lines. That's this picture down here in the lower right. You have occupied point, all the side shots, all that information is able to be viewed. It's captured. It's locating those points. Those usually turn off. You can't work with these on. It just makes it like mud. And then the traverse, I'll tend to turn the traverse off because, my eye catches these lines going across things that seem inappropriate. The traverse obviously is going to go from point to point and cross a lot of features. So the traverse, I tend to turn those off as well. Okay. The field book, to me, it's always cleaned up in two phases, the planimetric stuff and then the 3D. There's no use getting into the 3D. That's why I don't do the terrain, until the planimetric stuff is all cleaned up. So clean up the plan view, and then get into the elevational side. And there's a couple cues you have, red codes in the Explorer. In the message center, you'll see there's in the survey details, a message center that tells you that it doesn't understand these codes. And then there's in the decorations, there's an option for icons, and basically puts these little gold balls everywhere it feels like you need to address or look at that stuff. So those are indicators. Otherwise, you're just using your eyeballs. Things that just don't look right, things that actually shoot across, or things that crisscross out of place, or gaps that need to be closed. So anybody that's cleaned up survey files in the past, nothing new here. Just, you use your eyeballs and then obviously understanding the coding to do the corrections. The corrections are done either through the survey details, the flyout menus. If you had to delete a shot, there's a convenient delete there. So there's various ways to collect this. Now, one of the things that I think is very handy is these textual and graphical manipulators, because what you can do is you select a line and it's showing you these graphical manipulators and then the textual manipulators, in this case, the coding that's on there, and allows you to select that just like everywhere else in Open Roads and make modifications to it. So if you select something and they're not, they're visually little cues. So this green, the rectangle is where the start codes are. The triangles, it's facing the PC where it's moving into it. The other triangle is also facing into it. So this is the PC and the PT. And of course, it says it on there in the textual manipulator, but there's also these visual cues graphically on the graphical manipulators. This is something that invariably always happens. Something has to be tweaked. You gotta just slide a shot that, because of the rod tipped or whatever, you gotta slide a shot, tweak your things and line things up maybe a little bit better. That all that capability still exists. It's a little different you're working with, and I'll kind of head into this when you are working with observational data. With fixed point files, XYZ, this is pretty seamless. But with observational data, it's something you have to kind of think about. But these little tweaks, I always see this stuff happening that needs to be done. Now, also, you got to keep in mind the elevations. Depending on the version, when you're moving these points, it would zero the elevation. Sometimes it would use the active Z. Sometimes it, depending on how you do it, it maintains the elevation. So when you're moving these kind of things with the graphical manipulators, well, you really always have to be very attentive to the elevation. I always have the elevations turned on when I'm moving shots. I'm verifying what it is. I'm checking it when I land it. So there is a problem with these in 2021. It kind of looks like it's even maybe a little worse in 2022. And what that is when you're going to move a shot, I'll just kind of, just do this here. Let's say that, and again, I don't know why this ended up the way it ended up, but if I'm going to move this shot, and if you select this, you'll see that it has these graphical manipulators. Now, normally what would happen is when you hover over this, I think I have it here. When you hover over it, it should say move. That's an indicator that sort of and I always call it sort of fly paper, that you could touch it and it will stick to it and allow you to move it. So the move should activate. And then you should see this, the graphical textual manipulator there too. But what's happening now is if I hover over it, you'll see that it's basically giving the tip. So this isn't working. If I go to select any of this, it's not working. And what the problem is, or what the solution is, I say, is if I select this as an example and I hover over it, it doesn't work. So if I move out to a certain zoom level, you'll see now it's working. So unfortunately, it makes it not workable, because if you have something like this and you select it and you want to move this point, you literally have to move out to a point where it gets to be, just a mess. You can't move it. Now you can, in this version, you can just grab that point and literally just drag it somewhere. Again, watching the elevations, so you can just move these around and shuffle them around. Again, something that I highly recommend is, turning the elevations on to make sure the elevation isn't changing. But the more traditional way, or the programmatic way, is to use the manipulators, but it does allow you to move it this way. Now, keep in mind that you're not moving the line. You're actually moving the point. The line is ruled to the point. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're not highlighting the line, you're highlighting the points. And the points is what you're moving. The line will go with it because the lines are ruled to the points. Okay, so that is a problem. Hopefully that'll get fixed sometime, because I tend to use that now. I find myself just sort of dragging and dropping. Now, when you're using observational data, one of the drawbacks is, and this is kind of unusual, I really wasn't expecting this, because if you have a rule, if you're laying out geometry in open roads and you change a rule, it basically rewrites the rule. You move something, you have draw something with Civil AccuDraw, and you move it, it basically breaks that rule. What's happening here is when you move something, it's maintaining that observational rule. So if I take a shot and I drag it somewhere, let's say this point 2437, and I drag it, or this, okay, it's a 2442, and I drag it over here, the rule is still wanting to place it here. So when you're dragging these things around and moving these things around, the problem is that it's maintaining the original observational data. I have actually logged it, say it should just break that rule, dissolve that rule, remove that rule. But right now it doesn't. So what happens is, if you clean up something like this, and if you ever happen to import an additional file, you turn the rules on and off, update the standards, it's going to revert back to the original locations based on the rule. So that's kind of a problem. So what you have to do, and the workaround is again, it remembers that observational information. So the workaround of that is you have to go into its properties and turn off the observational rules. So, and again, I know that I'm throwing a lot at you. Hopefully you could, watch this video again later and kind of catch the things that maybe are more relevant or you're interested in. You could always, email me and, I could kind of bring a little more clarity to it. I do have some videos going up where I'm posting more and more of this stuff. So hopefully I'll, it's all in my book. I'm trying to do more videos, but so this observational rules, if you start to move things with the graphical manipulators, what I am now doing as a standard operating procedure is going into that day and I'm turning off the observational rules, setting it to false. That way it maintains that change. Okay, trying to wind down here. There are 3 data types now in Open Road Survey. There's what they call dynamic link linears, there's pointless linears, and there's graphical linears. Now, this is where I think the software got fairly complicated. I get why they did it. There's definitely some power to it. But I've been sticking with all the sort of traditional inroad survey type line work, which is really out of these categories, it's dynamic link linears. Dynamic link linears are sort of textbook. They follow the field code. They follow the order of the shots. They follow the link codes, control codes. This is really the way I'll say inroad survey always worked. If you hover over something, it says it's generated by link codes. Now, another methodology is you could take lines and convert it down or demote it. They call it demote it to a pointless linear. Pointless linears are ruled to the survey points, but they're not tied to the collection sequence. They're not tied to the field code. And basically, it allows you to pretty much create a survey doing connect the dots. And just a couple quick examples. So if you ever had a crew sort of shoot from one side to the other side, and they're giving it the right codes, but they're collecting it this way, and you end up with line work that's just jig-jag back and forth. Well, what you can do is you could basically demote this line work to a pointless linear, and then just basically connect the dots and say, this edge goes from here to here to here. The center line goes from here to here to here. This edge goes from here to here to here. And it allows you to rebuild that without having to worry about point numbers or code, link codes, control codes. So it's really a connected dots. In fact, if you had another scenario where you had a small window between, some construction activity, that all you had to do was you were just collecting shots. They said you got a half an hour to get in there underneath that bridge abutment and get out. So you're just collecting shots. You draw a sketch. So you import it and all you have is points. Maybe there's only one code, but you've collected all these shots, and then later you could go back in, import these points, and basically use pointless linears to just say, this connects to this, connects to this, connects to this, connects to this, and connect the dots and build the survey as if it was collected. So pointless linears, I definitely see the value. I'm sticking with the dynamic link linears because to me, that's more textbook and what people are more comfortable with or familiar with, but this definitely has its place. The last type is a graphical linear, and it's really just line work. It's just literally drawing the line work from point. You could snap to the points or not. They're not ruled to the points. It's just graphics. The interesting part about this is it's added to the field book as if it was collected. So the graphic link linears, and I'll kind of, if I could get to it here, I know we're kind of pushing the time. There goes my Q&A window. I use a graphical linear to put an exterior boundary in it. Now the exterior boundary, I'm putting it literally in the field book, and I'll kind of get into that. Survey annotation, boy, I'm not even going to go down this rabbit hole. This is a whole nother lecture. I cover this in my book on exactly how to create this, but the annotation, this is not something the user should be doing. This is all configuration. The workflow, collecting the data, import it into the field book, do your adjustments, and then push out your final downstream files. So pushing it out, when you create the terrain, you saw me create that terrain, it's linked. Again, I'm not going to cover the details of the terrain. Hopefully you know about terrains. If not, we could cover those in another lecture or something. But it's just right click on here, create terrain. Bang, done. You have the terrain. Now, you do a little cleanup in there. So if you have to do cleanup, that terrain is built in this active DGN file, all based on the survey settings. Of course, once it's created, you could make modifications. You could change the settings in there. Editing, though, the terrain is a child of the field book. So you can't just go in there and start modifying the terrain. Now, they did change that in 2022, R2, that I see that's coming out. But right now, in all earlier versions, you have to deactivate the survey processing rules so that you could get in there and modify the terrain. The terrain is just a reflection of what's in the field book. Now, this is the way I would always work anyway, is if I had, I create a terrain's just, just like you used to create DTMs, same kind of methodology, triangle based. So what I would always use a terrain for is finding conflicts. You still have that same process. You got to find conflicts. There's a report in there, terrain crossing features report. I use it to identify where there's issues, but I don't fix them in the terrain. You fix them in the field book. The terrain is just a reflection of the data in the field book. So I use it's like the resolve crossing segments command in inroads SS2. I'd use it the same way. I use it to identify issues, then I go back to the field book and fix it. So ultimately, I'll walk through all of these things. I don't do anything in the surface. I go back to the field book. And then when you do that, you go make all these changes, you go back to the field book, and now the terrain, the terrain is accurate based on the information in the field book. Now, boundary, you usually have to shrink wrap it. You want to shrink wrap your terrain. You don't want these extraneous triangles going out there. The process that I use is I create the terrain, I deactivate the survey processing rules. I mean, I captured this, sort of documented this so that if you wanted to go back on it, you kind of have this. Deactivate the survey processing rules. Then you could go and delete the triangles, the exterior triangles from the terrain. Then there's a tool to create a boundary graphic. All it does is it draws a line around the remaining triangles, and then basically push that graphic line back into the field book as a graphic linear feature. So you go in, you deactivate the terrain, delete your triangles. You end up, there's a tool to add a boundary. It just draws it in MicroStation. And then I take that and basically add it into the field book as a graphic feature. So now it's as if you physically collected the exterior boundary in the field book. So everything is in the field book. You back up the field book, this is all going with it. So I find this, very, very nice. I really like the way this works now, where the field book really is creating the graphics and is creating the terrain. Okay, last little bit here is you do sometimes, depending on the way something is collected, sometimes you have to reverse it. Retaining walls, you might have them drawn with a custom line style. Anything with custom line styles that may be directional, you might have to flip those sometimes. Shrub lines tend to have the shrub showing sort of the outer edge and the inside, where the inside of the shrubbery is, where the outside of the tree line is. So there's a tool that if you just hover over it, transpose linear features, it's built right into there, and it's actually swapping it in the field book. So it actually cleans up the field book so the lines are direction. Normally, you'd have to use that reverse curve direction tool in MicroStation that flip those. Now you're actually doing it in the field book. Again, the field book is now accurately going to reflect the graphics. And then ultimately pushing them to a separate DGN. Now, some people will just reference the active survey, design, set that puts in ProjectWise, maybe it's write protected, and design could just reference that survey. They could hover over, get all that attribute data. If that made someone nervous, then you could just export it out to a DGN file, and it just saves it as a dumbed down graphics. If you wanted to give it to a consultant and you didn't want to give them all your field data, you could just push it out to a DGN file, just a basic DGN file. And you could do the same thing with the terrain. So any graphics that are viewed there, you could just push it out to its own DGN file. So the terrain is built in that DGN, but again, you could just push it out to its own DGN file. And there's a couple different techniques to do that. I cover basically in my survey book. Okay, And I think that's it. And boy, I ran it to the wire, but if anybody wants to stick around, I will definitely answer questions. So this is where my roots started from, Fieldworks, back in the 1990, very basic. It evolved to inroad survey. And here we are now in open road survey in a new world and a somewhat more complex world. But, spend enough time in it, it grows on you. And that's that. So I will hang around if there are any questions. Otherwise.
Yeah, that was great, Mark. There's a lot of good information. If anybody has any questions, just type them into the Q&A real quick. We'll give you about a minute, and then we'll go ahead and end the session. But yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. That was a lot of good information in a short amount of time. But like Mark said, I'm going to post this video to our YouTube page. I'll send a link out when it's done. And then I'll send all your information and get the PDH credits, and I'll also send an email out.
And you can share my email too if you want, if they have any sort of added questions they want to, ask me directly. I'm available.
Sure. Do you have a slide with your email up on it? But I'll send it out in my emails also.
Just mark@zenengineering.com.
Okay, I'll send that out. So I think we have one here. This is not really related to survey terrain creation, but is there any way to update earthwork volume shapes after they are ran? Cut and fill volumes tool. Seems like it doesn't update with changes to the model and can't figure out the best way to update without creating a new file to rerun quantities.
I do not know the answer to that.
Okay. That was easy. That could be something that you could maybe email the MDOT survey people, see if they know. But
yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to test that.
Okay. Well, I think that's the only question we had. So
yeah.
If not, thanks again, Mark. Thanks everybody for joining. Be on the lookout for the invites to the conference, hopefully in the next week or two. And then we'll see you at the next webinar. I got to figure out what that'll be, and we'll send you the info.